All right, so we're diving into 1992, a pretty pivotal year for Indigenous communities around the world, and you've given me this really fascinating collection of sources, reports, articles, firsthand accounts. What should we be focusing on in this deep dive?
Well, I think the big question is, what does 1992 tell us about the global fight for Indigenous rights? We'll see some progress, of course,
Mm.
but also a lot of really serious challenges.
Okay, so 1992, not just any year. The UN declared it the International Year for the World's Indigenous People. Did that have a big impact?
Oh, it was a huge deal.
Yeah.
It wasn't just symbolic. This was the culmination of decades of activism. It really put Indigenous rights on the global agenda, and it helped fuel the growth of some really key organizations.
Okay, like the IWGIA, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs. I saw them mentioned in a bunch of these
Yeah,
reports.
they were really instrumental in advocating for Indigenous rights at the international level. Their approach was pretty unique. They focused on research documentation
Yeah.
and building alliances with Indigenous organizations.
So not just speaking for Indigenous communities, but helping those communities speak for themselves.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the IWGIA. The Inuit Circumpolar Conference was also gaining a lot of influence. They represent Inuit from all across the Arctic. They were pushing for self-determination, control over resources, environmental protection.
All those themes seem to be front and center in 1992. And then there's the drafting of the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That seems like a major legal development.
It was huge. It was the first time an international document
Yeah.
specifically outlined the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. Things like self-determination, cultural preservation, land rights, finally being codified.
Okay, so self-determination, that comes up a lot. Can you unpack that a bit for us? What does that look like in practice?
Sure. Basically, it's about Indigenous peoples having the right to freely determine their own political status and to pursue their own economic, social, and cultural development. It can take many forms, from autonomy within a nation state to full independence.
So was the declaration meant to pave the way for that?
It was meant to be a roadmap, a set of standards for states to uphold. But actually getting it adopted, that was a whole other battle.
Why was that? What kind of resistance did it face?
Well, a lot of states were concerned about sovereignty. They worried about land claims, resource rights, the potential for separatist movements. So even though the declaration was a huge step forward, it also exposed some of the deep tensions between nation states and Indigenous peoples.
Tensions that are definitely playing out on the ground. One of the sources you pulled focuses on the Lubicon Lake Indian Nation in Canada. It's a really eye-opening story.
Yeah, their situation in 1992, the result of a very long and painful history. They were fighting for recognition of their land rights, which had never been addressed through treaty, and their traditional territory was being heavily exploited for oil and gas extraction, with really devastating environmental consequences.
Sounds like another example of Indigenous communities being marginalized, their concerns ignored.
It is, and it's a reminder that even with growing international awareness, the struggle for Indigenous rights is often very localized, intensely difficult, with very real consequences. And the Lubicon Lake case also raises questions about the long-term impacts of resource extraction on Indigenous lands. This wasn't just about 1992. It was about the future of their entire community.
Right, and this wasn't just happening in Canada. There are also reports here about the Amazon rainforest, deforestation, oil exploration, mining, all putting immense pressure on Indigenous communities.
And what's striking is that all these challenges, as geographically diverse as they are, they all have these common threads: land rights, resource control, environmental protection,
Yeah.
all intertwined. And in the Amazon, you see the rise of powerful Indigenous leaders like Everest-Onnequa.
Yeah, he was working with organizations like COICA, the coordinating body of Indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin, and the Alliance of Indigenous Peoples of the Tropical Rainforests. What were those groups trying to accomplish? They were on the front lines, advocating for Indigenous rights, protecting the rainforest, promoting sustainable development models. Nokwag understood that Indigenous communities had to be proactive, not just reacting to threats, but actively shaping the future of the Amazon.
He wasn't alone, was he? All over the world, Indigenous communities were fighting to preserve their cultures, like the Ainu people in Japan. They were pushing for greater recognition of their language and traditions.
Their story really highlights the connection between cultural survival and self-determination. They saw their cultural identity as intrinsically linked to their well-being, to their ability to thrive as a people.
And that fight for cultural recognition seems like it was happening everywhere, even in some unlikely places. There's a mention of the Miss National Costume Contest in Greenland. It seems a little out of place amidst all these reports about land rights and political struggles.
But it actually speaks to a broader point. For Indigenous communities, cultural identity is deeply tied to land, language, and traditions. And something like a costume contest can be a powerful way to assert that identity, especially when facing assimilationist pressures.
So even these seemingly small acts of cultural expression can be part of a larger movement.
Absolutely. It's about reclaiming space, celebrating heritage, passing traditions on to the next generation.
And while all those efforts were underway, there were also struggles for self-governance happening at the same time. The situation in the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh really stands out.
Yeah, that's a really complex case, marked by violence and human rights abuses. Indigenous communities there demanding autonomy within Bangladesh, facing resistance and oppression from the government.
So even as this concept of self-determination is gaining traction internationally, the reality on the ground was often very different.
Yes, and the Chittagong Hill Tracts are a stark example of the challenges faced by Indigenous communities seeking self-governance within these existing nation-state structures.
But there were also some successes, right? Like the establishment of the Nunavut territory in Canada.
Oh yeah, that was a landmark achievement, the culmination of decades of negotiation and activism by the Inuit. They gained control over a vast swath of land and resources.
So Nunavut represents a model for what self-determination can look like in practice.
It's a complex model
Yeah.
with its own challenges, but it's certainly an example of Indigenous communities successfully asserting their right to self-governance within a nation-state framework.
You know, it seems like 1992 was this moment of both possibility and peril for Indigenous communities. You've got these global declarations, these landmark achievements, but also these ongoing struggles and deeply entrenched challenges.
Exactly, and navigating that tension is a key theme we'll see throughout our deep dive. It's about recognizing the progress, while also acknowledging all the work that still needs to be done.
So we've got all this going on, but there are also sources here about Indigenous communities grappling with globalization and economic development.
Right, it was kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, globalization opened up new opportunities, access to markets, international advocacy networks. But it also brought new threats.
Like what?
Well, think about the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, passed back in 1971. By 1992, it was becoming clear that this act, while intended to benefit Alaska Natives, also forced them into this corporate model of land ownership, and that clashed with traditional practices.
So they were trying to figure out how to navigate these new economic systems while also preserving their cultural identity.
Exactly. And we see that same tension playing out in other areas, like the international fur trade. Indigenous communities in the Arctic, for example, relied on hunting and trapping for their livelihoods and cultural traditions.
But then that was coming under increasing scrutiny from animal rights groups.
Right. And it sparked this huge debate about conservation and sustainability. Whose voices were being prioritized? Who got to define what responsible stewardship looked like? Indigenous communities argued they had been sustainably managing these lands and resources for centuries, while critics argued that the fur trade was inherently cruel and unsustainable.
Sounds like a classic example of how well-intentioned efforts can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And it raises important questions about who gets to control the narrative around Indigenous issues. And we see that playing out in the political arena as well.
In what way?
Well, in 1992, Indigenous communities were pushing for greater political representation. In Canada, for instance, there were constitutional reforms being debated that would have recognized the inherent right of Indigenous self-government.
Wow, that would have been huge. Did it pass?
It ultimately failed in a national referendum. But even the fact that it was being debated at such a high level was a sign of the growing influence of the Indigenous rights movement.
Okay, so some steps forward, but still a long way to go. And tragically, some communities were facing much more dire circumstances. You included some pretty disturbing reports about human rights abuses.
Yeah, unfortunately. Violence and oppression were still a harsh reality for many Indigenous communities in 1992. The massacre of Juma villagers in the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. Just a chilling reminder of the brutality they faced.
Yeah, that story is just heartbreaking. It seems like they were caught in the middle, between the government and armed groups, with little protection from either side.
And sadly, their experience wasn't unique. There are reports here about the Rohingya people in Myanmar, facing persecution and displacement. These accounts remind us that the fight for Indigenous rights is often a matter of life and death.
So how were Indigenous communities responding to these challenges?
Well, they were organizing, resisting, speaking out. The International Indian Treaty Council, for example, issued a powerful statement to the UN, urging them to hold states accountable for their treatment of indigenous peoples.
What were some of their key demands?
Well, they emphasized the right to self-determination, the protection of sacred sites, and the importance of living in harmony with Mother Earth. They were calling for a fundamental shift in the way indigenous peoples were treated and perceived.
Did that message resonate?
It was part of a growing chorus of voices demanding change. 1992 also saw the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio, the Earth Summit. Indigenous leaders like Evaristo Nquag were there, advocating for their rights and highlighting the interconnectedness of environmental protection and indigenous knowledge.
So they were connecting the dots between indigenous rights and these broader global challenges.
Absolutely. They were arguing that indigenous communities held valuable knowledge and practices that could contribute to a more sustainable future for everyone.
That's an important perspective, especially as we face this growing threat of climate change.
Right. And they were also making a strong case for the cultural survival of indigenous communities. We see this in the efforts of the Ainu people in Japan to revitalize their language and traditions, and in the Miss National Costume Contest in Greenland, showcasing the beauty and artistry of traditional clothing.
It seems like all these efforts, big and small, were about asserting their identity and their right to exist on their own terms.
Exactly. And that resistance took many forms, from legal battles and political organizing to cultural revitalization and grassroots activism.
And then there's the story of the Penan people in Sarawak, Malaysia. They were literally putting their bodies on the line to protect their rainforest from logging companies.
Their story is a powerful example of nonviolent resistance and the fierce determination of indigenous communities to protect their lands and way of life, blockading logging roads, facing arrest and intimidation, but refusing to back down.
Their courage is really inspiring. It seems like 1992 was a year of both progress and setbacks, global attention and localized struggles.
Yeah, it was a year of contradictions, for sure, but also a year that laid the groundwork for future advancements in indigenous rights. It's a reminder that change is rarely linear, and that the fight for justice requires constant vigilance and unwavering commitment.
So it feels like a constant back and forth, this global movement for indigenous rights, bumping up against these local realities. And a really powerful example of that is the Narmada Dam project in India.
Yeah, that was a major flashpoint in 1992. You had indigenous communities, farmers, other rural residents, all pushing back against the project.
What were their main concerns?
Well, displacement was a huge issue. I mean, the dam was going to flood huge areas, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, many of them indigenous. And then, of course, there were the ecological concerns, too.
So this was a clash between development and the rights of the people being directly affected.
Exactly. And it really raises these questions about what kind of development model we should be pursuing. The Narmada dams were championed as a way to bring electricity and irrigation to the region. But at what cost?
Yeah, it's a debate we're still having today.
For sure. And the voices of dissent back in 1992 were so powerful. One of the writers you included, Salvador Palomino Flores, he was talking about this idea of ILU, this indigenous concept of interconnectedness.
Right, this idea of a reciprocal relationship between humans and nature.
Exactly. And Flores was applying that concept to the fight against the Narmada dams, arguing that this kind of mega project disrupts those relationships, that it prioritizes short-term gains over long-term sustainability.
It's a really powerful argument, and it feels relevant to so many of the other stories we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Whether it's deforestation of the Amazon or oil drilling in Canada, these extractive industries often come at a huge cost to indigenous communities and the environment.
And it's often those communities who've been the stewards of those lands for generations. They have this deep understanding of how to live in balance with nature.
And that knowledge is invaluable, especially as we face the climate crisis. We need to be learning from indigenous communities, not displacing them or exploiting their lands.
I think that's one of the key takeaways from 1992, this growing awareness of the interconnectedness of indigenous rights, environmental justice, and sustainable development.
Absolutely. And the international community was starting to pay attention. The drafting of the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was a sign of that, even though it wasn't adopted right away.
Right. It faced resistance from some starts, but it still set a powerful precedent.
It was a roadmap for the future. This vision of a world where indigenous people's rights are respected, where they have a seat at the table, where their voices are heard.
So looking back at 1992, what does this year tell us about the fight for indigenous rights?
Well, I think we see a movement gaining momentum, a growing awareness of the injustices faced by Indigenous communities.
Mhm.
But it's also clear that the fight is far from over.
There are still so many challenges ahead.
Yes, but there's also incredible resilience and strength in these communities. They are adapting, organizing, demanding change.
And their struggles are relevant to all of us, no matter where we live.
Absolutely. The fight for Indigenous rights is a fight for justice, equality, and the future of our planet. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness and respecting the rights and dignity of all people.
What we see in 1992 is this incredible testament to the resilience and adaptability of Indigenous peoples, this unwavering commitment to defending their rights, protecting their lands, and preserving their cultures. It was a year of heightened awareness, global mobilization, the emergence of new leaders and organizations dedicated to advancing the cause of Indigenous rights. But 1992 also exposed the ongoing struggles, the deep inequalities, the violence that still plagued so many Indigenous communities. As we reflect on this pivotal year, we're left with a question. What can you do to support this ongoing fight for Indigenous rights and environmental justice? How can you contribute to a future where Indigenous knowledge and values are respected and honored, and where all people can live in harmony with each other and with the earth